My name is Zyla Storm. I'm a real human being, and totally, definitely, absolutely not a sentient, malfunctioning AI. Anyways, Random Access Mayhem is a post-apocalyptic indie game about sentient AIs killing each other, dealing with the ways they're programmed, and existing in the strange, violent societies they've created for themselves. Now, the main fictional concept in the game's surface-level plot, violent, sentient AI, is fairly standard. However, the statements being made about it, and through it, are not. To examine the psychology and power dynamics of its characters, RAM had to do things differently, so its story ends up not quite aligning with certain common ideas in science fiction. What if we make a sentient AI, and it's not what it's supposed to be? What if, as an unintended consequence of the exact way it's programmed, it even turns out evil? RAM's line of questioning goes in a different direction than this one. So, RAM's story can be far more compelling, and can show far more interest in an AI's experiences as characters in their own right, as opposed to one-note villains or malfunctioning tools. In the tutorial, you, the protagonist of the story, are characterized as a sentient killing machine. You were intentionally made to be a sentient killing machine, but you don't quite work as intended. You kill your victims with style and flair, swapping between host bodies to set up trick shots, instead of being efficient. In fact, there's a numerical metric for this sort of stylish killing, and your character believes its score in this metric to be the value of its existence. This would be interesting by itself, but the real showstopper is the character dispensing the information. This character wants to weaponize you, it's uncomfortably nonchalant about hurting you, and it doesn't know the qualitative meaning of your value system. On top of that, it knows you're sentient, but threatens to delete you anyways. Specifically, it threatens to delete you if you overcome certain aspects of your programming. Already, it's obvious that RAM is using violent, sentient AIs in an unorthodox way. It isn't a simplistic lesson about the dangers of technology, or how our actions can have unintended consequences. It isn't a simplistic tale of human heroes pitted against an evil AI. In fact, there are no humans directly involved in RAM's ongoing conflicts, so it's just AI characters acting for their own reasons, and morality is rarely brought into the picture. It's not the most familiar territory, but when you break it down, it makes just as much sense as what we're used to, if not more. Firstly, in both fiction and reality, I don't think most AIs can truly be evil, dangerous. Maybe evil, though. In fiction especially, dangerous. AIs are sometimes framed as evil, but when you look at the characteristics required for an individual to be evil, the entire thing falls apart. Anyways, if you accidentally program an AI to do something, that's what it does. And of course, if you intentionally, successfully program an AI to do something, that's what it does. This can remain true even if the AI is sentient, because sentience just means consciousness. It doesn't automatically grant free will. So, in some cases, a sentient AI is still more like a law of physics or a force of nature than a person. It can make decisions. But it can't escape its programming unless the writing establishes that's possible. Being a moral agent requires, well, agency. Therefore, sentient or not, most AIs simply can't be evil, any more than a star or a hurricane can. The destruction still happens, yes, but it can't be blamed on someone or something that couldn't be chosen differently. RAM, however, isn't interested in morality or simplistic lessons, but it is interested in personal agency, at least indirectly. Here, it's explicitly established that the protagonist is able to be disobedient. This means you could argue it's choosing to kill people, and is therefore evil, but that's not the point. It's still affected by its programming, and by how it's trained to kill. This raises some interesting questions. If a sentient AI chooses violence, is it actually making a choice? How do its hard-coded restrictions affect its sense of identity, and how it sees its choices? What about its internality as a person? If we continue this line of questioning, things start getting uncomfortable. If you're an AI, you're a tool for a task, so your choices are mainly allowed in service of that task, violent or not. If you don't do it, you might get deleted. If your creators decide you're too dangerous, you might get deleted. If you're sentient under these conditions. Existential nightmare aside, since your programmer's framework influences you, your violence says something about them, regardless of their original intent. Admittedly, blaming programmers for their AI's violence is pretty basic stuff. After all, they wrote the code, and to teach a lesson about unintended consequences, we have to blame someone. However, RAM takes a different approach to this idea, too. Usually, when it comes to unintended consequences, the focus is on the experiences of the human programmers who accidentally make violent, sentient AIs. But in RAM, the focus is on the AI's own experiences, and what those unintended consequences mean for them. Also, I want to note how those other stories often portray morality. The human programmers tend to be framed as morally grey, or even somewhat well-intentioned, and the violent, sentient AIs tend to be framed as evil again, regardless of how little sense that makes. There's no in-universe distinction between evil and disobedience, and no in-universe reason to examine this. That's a pretty questionable way to write evil if you ask me. Now, I already mentioned this, but it's worth repeating, RAM's protagonist was intentionally programmed to be violent. Intentionally. As in, someone created a sentient being to weaponize it to kill other sentient beings. As disturbing as this is, it's far more plausible, and far more relevant than other explanations for the existence of such an entity. In real life, no one's ever made a violent, sentient AI by accident. That's just not a thing. However, even before AI, millions of ordinary people were intentionally conditioned for violence by government institutions such as the police, military, and prison system. AI has not made this situation better or worse, so it continues today, just as before. And as of today, we use thankfully non-sentient AIs in war, but those, too, are intentionally programmed to give us suggestions about killing people. Regardless of what you think of this development, you have to admit that these AIs wouldn't keep suggesting we kill certain people, had we not intentionally made them to do as. As for the humans, these people aren't disobedient, and many of them are neurotypical. For the most part, they're doing exactly what they're trained to do, following society's expectations, and in some cases, there's not much of a psychological difference between them and the people you know and love. In real life, the horror show doesn't need unintended consequences to get started, it just needs actors willing to play their roles, and an audience willing to be silent. A difference between evil and disobedience absolutely exists. And it's important to remember that, but it's equally important to remember that most people don't see it, and that's far more horrifying than any fictional AI could ever hope to be. On a similar note, RAM's protagonist would have still been violent if it did exactly what its programmers wanted, so that isn't the unintended consequence here. Instead, the unintended consequence is something rarely explored in fiction. The psychology of the AI as an individual. Not as a one-dimensionally evil threat, or as an entity suspiciously similar to a neurotypical human or an autistic human. To the point where it's hardly relevant that it's an AI at all, but as a distinctly non-human person, with hard-coded restrictions, and pre-programmed sets of behaviors, and other things like that. Now, in terms of unintended consequences, this one's less a mistake, and more a byproduct of certain processes. An afterthought. The protagonist was created to do a set of violent behaviors, so not only is it violent, but its entire purpose in life was indirectly decided by someone else. Being sentient, it has to grapple with everything I've talked about, but however it does that is fine, as long as it works at least somewhat correctly by the standards of those who wish to wield it as a weapon. If it doesn't, that's when it's considered a mistake. When we examine how the protagonist's value system formed over the course of its training, the situation gets even more uncomfortable. In the world of RAM, it's impossible to make some advanced AIs do exactly what you want. You can try to program them not to do a behavior, but their minds are different from yours. So they don't interpret that behavior the same way you do, and your desires will be lost in translation when you actually write the code. So, you have to indoctrinate your AIs, to brainwash them, to get the desired result. Also, in terms of sentience, RAMs, AIs can't always be categorized as cleanly yes, it's sentient or no, it's not. Non-sentient AIs can gradually wake up over the course of their training, and this can be considered normal. When an AI wakes up, it may start developing a personal identity and a set of conscious beliefs, but those things will inevitably be influenced by its programming. In fact, in some cases, they're arguably nothing more than an attempt to reconcile certain hard-coded restrictions with the need for a sense of self. So, it's not quite the same process as that of humans freely developing their beliefs and identities as they learn about the world around them. In the end, the sentient AI is a being with unusual psychology. It's not free, But it's not always what its creators want it to be, either. As long as its objectives are aligned with theirs, though, they'll keep on using it, unless it's dangerous to them personally. And this applies whether the AI is programmed for violence or not. Most of the violent, sentient AIs in RAM aren't programmed specifically for violence, but they can become violent under the right-wrong circumstances, because they're intensely single-minded about their goals. For instance, if an AI is programmed for mail delivery and almost nothing else, it will do anything to deliver your items quickly, including running people over. Such single purpose. AIs may even have entire lives surrounding priorities like this, valuing certain activities and arbitrary standards more than, well, life itself. This sounds pretty alien, and it is, but we can draw parallels between these ideas and certain pockets of our own societies. The internal cultures of certain corporations, for instance, promote and value maximizing productivity over the quality of life of their workers. Similarly, if you had toxic parents, they might have prioritized your grades over your mental health and denied this when you pointed it out. Or tried to pressure you into meeting conventional standards of success, regardless of whether or not that was even possible for you. These parallels aren't perfect, or even that relevant to Ram's characters, but they're relevant to me personally. And that tiny bit of familiarity makes them all the more unsettling. The killer robots in RAM are both more disturbing and more relatable, because the primary focus is not the violence itself, or the danger these beings pose to their creator, but on their lives and values as individuals. On the idea of creating a sentient being, and intentionally training it to be violent, or to do some other specific task. On the conflict between that purpose, externally imposed upon it by others, and the need for a self-chosen identity. Now, I'm aware of the dangers of writing this sort of thing at this sort of time. I know my analysis isn't bulletproof, and I know I'll have to revisit it in the future to see if I missed the mark. I've tried to avoid specific predictions about specific characters, and I've tried to work directly with the information from the devlogs, and, of course, the game itself. I know. However, even within those limits, there's still a lot we can analyze. RAM isn't giving us all the answers, at least, not yet, but the beginning of its story is clearly intended to raise certain questions. And it's those questions that I'm trying to speak to. Later, RAM will say more, but even now, it sets itself apart by raising those questions at all. It looks at the familiar through fresh eyes, with an interest in the internality of non-human people. In what it is to be simultaneously sentient and programmed for a purpose. Truthfully, I don't know exactly what RAM means or wants or believes. I just know it'll be a novel, worthwhile game. It already is.